Congressman Kilmer, thank you so much for joining me today.
You bet. Great to be with you
It's nice.
virtually.
Yes, it's nice that we can be together, but in our homes.
Yeah, I'm getting used to a lot of Zoom calls and teleconferences and about 12 hours a day of talking to people over my computer.
Oh my goodness, I can only imagine from your position. At my house, it's just getting a bunch of preschoolers together so they can see each other and wave and sing songs.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
How are you and your family doing?
You know what? We're hanging in there. It's obviously all this is challenging for I think everybody's family. I was in Washington D.C. last week, but this week my office is my dining room table, and my coworkers are a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old, and an Australian Shepherd, and they don't all three of them don't always necessarily want to keep it down or respect that it's the workplace. So we're making it work. It was hard for them. They're in fifth and eighth grade, and like a lot of kids in school, it was hard for them to see school get canceled. We went and had to pick up their stuff because our school district said now's the time to come get your possessions, and both of them took it pretty hard because they're graduating from elementary school and from middle school. So I'm very conscious that we got a whole ton of families all around our region that are going through that, and unfortunately a whole lot more than that.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to think about the children's perspective. I heard on a podcast someone framing it in a way that I hadn't really thought of before, but that for many children, this is their first really big loss. This is the first time they've really had to experience losing something that's important to them and really learning how to grieve that.
Yeah.
And what an important time for us to be there for them as parents and as a community.
No doubt. I think and we've tried to put out resources on our website and through social media for kids. In fact, I'm doing a Facebook Live town hall for kids where we're taking questions from kids. My daughter said she'll read some of the questions, and I got a pediatrician who's going to answer some of them. And so, we're trying to make sure that parents are armed with the information that they need to help navigate these really tough times.
That's fantastic. Are you guys, as a family, working on any of those popular quarantine projects that are going around, like sourdough bread or victory gardens?
You want to know the truth? The one thing I was a couple weeks ago. The only way I can think to put this is I was looking like the hidden fourth member of the Bee Gees. I had grown a shaggy beard, and my hair was definitely rocking the 1970s vibe. And my daughters spent a fair amount of time on YouTube to try to figure out how to cut my hair, and I let them do it. So that was probably the best family project. I'm glad that you can only see me from the front because there was mistakes were made. I'll just put it that way. But we they did all things considered, they did a great job. I was very proud of them and grateful for the people of YouTube for helping them learn how to do it.
For sure. I have to say, that's probably great content. Next time you need a haircut, you might want to film that.
It's funny. We did it. My wife filmed some of it, and I was like, no one is ever going to see this.
Oh, that's great to hear. There's so many random things really keeping people occupied right now. And honestly, it's a great time to find out, if we have the mental and physical capacity for doing so, what some of those interests and hobbies might be.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what? I think one of the things that I'm gratified by is, listen, this is a really tough time for people. Um, and trying to find joy where you can, trying to find kindness where you can, I think is really important. I'm very struck by the fact that while this virus is very contagious, so is kindness, so is caring about your neighbors. And, we've certainly tried to do that in our neighborhood. And I know that a lot of folks all throughout Kitsap County are doing the same.
I agree. That good news is definitely the stuff I'm clinging to right now. And
Amen.
some of that is actually one of the reasons that I reached out to you. And that's the Kitsap Pandemic Community Support Coalition. Could you tell me a little bit about that and your participation in it?
Sure. I mean, I really give Kitsap County a lot of credit because when we face challenges, I think one of the most important things is to get all the oars in the water rowing in the same direction. And so you saw, um, leaders from philanthropy, the community foundation, nonprofits, local elected leaders, including myself, the folks from the business community, all aligned saying, let's make sure that we are a community where we're taking care of each other and solving problems. And so it's been an effort to form a coalition where we're talking to each other and identifying those problems and trying to address them together.
It sounds like an excellent forum for just communication. I'm sure there are so many problems that can be solved by one another by working together, and just putting all the voices in one room, I imagine, has a great impact.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, the one of the good things you see about it is, you'll see someone on the line say, "Hey, this is an issue. Is anyone doing anything about it?" And one of our state legislators are able to chime in and say, "Well, here's what the state's doing," or I'm able to chime in and say, "Well, we just passed the CARES Act, and here's what that does." And trying to just share information and make sure that everybody, these resources that are being provided are only helpful if people know about them and are able to access them.
Absolutely true. What is it that you see as the unique challenges that Kitsap County residents are facing specifically?
Yeah, I think it's important up front to, just recognize how disruptive this whole thing has been. We've seen statewide now more than 14,000 cases, more than 800 people have died. In Kitsap County, 148 confirmed cases as we film this. Two people have died, and I'm very conscious of the fact that every one of those people are somebody's mom or dad, or son or daughter, or husband or wife. And on top of that, we've seen just extraordinary economic disruption. From mid-February to mid-March, we saw about 750 people in Kitsap County apply for unemployment assistance over that 4-week period, about 750. In the 5 weeks after that, from mid-March to April 25th, we saw almost 24,000 people apply for unemployment assistance. And so you've seen just a real challenge, in part because um, and I think folks watching this will know and appreciate this. In our community, we depend on small businesses, right? We don't have Microsoft and Boeing and some of the big fellows. We've got, local employers, and they've really been rocked by the, sort of medically induced coma that our economy has been put in. And I think part of the response needs to be to have their back, and that's, part of the reason that the CARES Act had a specific focus on trying to help small businesses, and had this thing called the Paycheck Protection Program to provide loans for small businesses, but those loans can be forgiven if they hold on to their employees. Congress last week went back to DC and put more money into that program because it was exhausted, and made sure that our community-based lenders, our community banks, our credit unions are able to have some money carved out specifically to them so that they can help those that most need it on the ground in our communities. I've introduced a bill called the Paycheck Protection Program Extension Act, to basically put that program on steroids, to roughly triple the size of it, and to make sure that our mom and pop employers all over Kitsap County are able to get help as long as they need it. Because I think it's an acknowledgement that the best way to handle unemployment is to keep people from becoming unemployed in the first place. We've also introduced a bill called the Restore America's Main Streets Act to provide grant-based aid to our small businesses. Again, I talked to a guy the other night. He said, "Yeah, I spent 32 years trying to build my business," and he said, "I've put my life into this." He said, "I got about a dozen families who depend on me for a paycheck," and he said, "I'm trying to decide whether I should just fold the tent or whether I hunker down and try to weather this." And I think part of the role of the federal government, that's not his fault. That's not the fault of anybody who's going through this. And so part of the role of the federal government should be to say, "You're not on your own here. We're going to try to have your back." So that's really driven a lot of what I've worked on. The other thing you asked, you said, what's unique for Kitsap County? Our largest employer is a large naval shipyard. So that's a unique issue. We've had very frequent conversations with the leadership there. I did a letter to the Secretary of the Navy and to the Secretary of Defense asking that incentive pay be provided for the folks who are going into the shipyard. and to make sure that there's adequate personal protective equipment just to protect those workers. Obviously, they have an important national security mission, but the mission of the shipyard is also to keep those thousands of workers who are coming there safe and healthy.
Absolutely. It really seems like a lot of that work was done initially, these care packages, for a certain chunk of time. And here we are, tomorrow begins the month of May. And I believe some of what you're working on is really extending, as you said, putting them on steroids to really extend the length and the breadth of the assistance that's available to everyone.
Yeah, I think to some degree, what you've seen really over the course of the last 2 months is just a repetition of the scene from Jaws, where Brody says, "We're going to need a bigger boat." Um, you go back to the beginning of this. Initially, the Trump administration's proposed coronavirus response package was $2 billion, with most of the funding coming from funding that had been set aside to deal with the Ebola virus. What Congress passed was $8.6 billion, and that was considered to be a lot of money.
Mhm.
2 months later, um, Congress, in the CARES Act, passed something that was $2.2 trillion. And even that, the Paycheck Protection Program ran out of funds. We're hearing from state and local governments that they're facing enormous challenges just because of the dramatic fall in revenue because our economy is largely shut down. And so what you're seeing in terms of federal response is just that recognition that people on the front lines of this, our healthcare workers, need to have the resources required to care for patients and to keep our frontline healthcare workers safe. The personal protective equipment. I've heard the president say we're at war against an invisible enemy, but we can't send our soldiers into war without the equipment that they need, and they need that personal protective equipment. They need testing capacity to help us get through this. People shouldn't have to lose their house for something that's not their fault. And so part of the federal response has been let's protect renters from eviction, let's protect homeowners from foreclosure. I sponsored a bill to provide emergency rental assistance to folks because, again, it's not their fault. Students, I zoomed into a Olympic college class earlier today, and students have really seen their lives turned upside down by this. And part of the approach from the federal government has been to say, if you shouldn't take on more student debt for something that's not your fault. If you've had to drop out, that shouldn't count against your financial aid caps. Or we at the beginning of this, I had one of the college leaders reach out and say, I've got students on my campus that do work study. He said, I just shut down my campus. So who's paying for that? Is it, the student or the college or the federal government? Well, because of the CARES Act, it's the federal government. And that's appropriate because that burden shouldn't fall on the backs of students. But we're, just seeing a lot of this process has been trying to stick fingers and toes in the holes in the dam. And, because this is the most significant public health crisis in my lifetime and the most significant economic disruption since the Great Depression, um, there's just a lot of holes in the dam. And the federal response is just trying to plug as many of them as quickly as possible.
For sure. How are you feeling about this on a human level? I imagine you're hearing from so many different sectors of society, from these small businesses, from the military, from unemployed. I imagine your office hears from a little bit of everybody. And
Yeah.
how does that feel to you?
Well, I mentioned, a lot of my day is on doing video conferences and doing phone calls, mostly with folks who are being impacted by this. And thankfully, I have a terrific team that's working day and night just to try to help people. The good news is, from a legislative standpoint, there's been a lot of tools in the toolbox to try to help people weather this storm. It's been slow going in terms of seeing some of that assistance deployed. So, for example, the cash rebate checks have taken a while to get out the door, and there's some people who still haven't gotten them. It is a good thing that the CARES Act provided additional unemployment assistance, and including expanding eligibility for folks who previously hadn't been covered before. Because when all this started, you started hearing, for example, from independent contractors and sole proprietors and from gig workers who said, gosh, I don't even qualify for unemployment assistance. Well, you do now under the CARES Act. It's been bumpy, because our state's unemployment security system has been really overwhelmed by people applying for assistance. But the fact is, that assistance is there, and part of the role of our office is try to make sure people know where to go for the help that's being made available. Um, these are hard times for folks. It's a really challenging period. Both, I've talked to people who are really afraid of getting sick. We did a video town hall with nurses, and they're really scared. And at the same time, I've been on video conferences with chambers of commerce and with economic development councils, and we're also seeing a real disruption to our Main Street employers. And so, uh, part of my job is just to solve problems for the people I represent, to make sure that we come out of this trying to save lives and trying to make sure that people have economic opportunity even when all of this is done.
Sure. I imagine that's a heavy load to carry at the end of the day.
Well, I'm not worried about the load I carry. I worry about the people we represent. There's people who are dealing with some really difficult challenges, and we've lost lives through this. And I think about our frontline healthcare workers. I think about our firefighters. I think about our grocery workers. And to me, one of the most important things coming out of this, probably the most common question I get from people is, so when do we go back to normal? And part of my reaction is, maybe we don't want to go back to normal the way it was, because normal the way it was, we had 30 million people in this country that don't have paid sick leave and paid family leave. And maybe we want a new normal where people don't have to choose between their paycheck and their health. In the old normal, we don't have enough capacity in the United States of America to provide personal protective equipment to our frontline healthcare workers. Maybe we don't want to go back to that normal. Maybe we want to have a new normal where the United States of America is building stuff and manufacturing masks and gloves and face shields and tests, so that we can, weather these sorts of storms and not depend on China or any other country for the equipment that we need to keep people safe. In the old normal, I represent a district where we're in the bottom 20% of the country when it comes to access to the internet. And that's not about whether you can watch Tiger King on Netflix. That's, can you apply for unemployment assistance when you've lost your job? Or can you, if your school got canceled, can you learn online? And for a whole lot of families in the district I represent, the answer to that is no. And so my hope is, in the new normal, we look at access to the internet like they looked at rural electrification decades ago, and we say, well, it's not okay to have people not have what really, in my mind, is increasingly a necessary basic utility. So there's a lot of lessons, I think, that will need to be learned from this, and my hope and my work as the representative for this area is to make sure that we have people's back, that um, and we're lucky in the state of Washington. I think our governor has responded to this really well. You've seen states where people had their voting rights denied. What happened in Wisconsin, I thought was really outrageous, and maybe that's a lesson learned from this too. That states like ours that have universal vote by mail, that maybe others can learn from that, and we create a new normal.
Absolutely. Along those lines, what are your thoughts on looking at reopening, at the timing, and even the process for doing so?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I give the governor a lot of credit for working closely with, not just the employer community, but with public health professionals. Because at the end of the day, this needs to be driven by public health, um, in part because, as much as this has been awful to have to do this, stay home, stay healthy, and has been disruptive, perhaps the only thing that would be worse is having to do it twice, because we didn't reopen strategically, and we ended up with a whole bunch of cases, and we had to wind things down again. And so I think you'll soon, and maybe it'll happen before this even airs. I think you're going to see the governor lay out a strategic phased approach that's focused on the advice from public health professionals. One of the things that I'm really focused on is testing. We need more testing capacity, and I've directly pushed the president and the vice president to ramp up the use of the Defense Production Act so that we have testing capacity, because part of our ability to reopen our economy requires us to have far more testing capacity than we have right now. And there's things we're short of. We were short of swabs, we're short of reagents, we're short of personal protective equipment. And the response from the federal government cannot be, well, states all have to compete with each other for these scarce resources. We need to have a national testing strategy. Part of the legislation that we passed last week requires that from the administration, and it can't just be 50 state testing strategies stapled together. We need to see a national strategy that says, here's who needs to have a test for public health purposes. Therefore, here's how many tests we're going to need. And here's the strategy for how the federal government will ensure that every state, including the state of Washington that was on the front line of this, has the resources it needs to get those tests so that we can get our economy reopened and save some lives.
Mhm. It's such a balancing act. I mean, I certainly don't envy anyone in a leadership position right now trying to navigate that, because there's so many points of view that are all so very important. For myself personally, I'm immunocompromised, so I am not leaving my house, and I am one of those who is scared.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. But that doesn't mean I don't understand exactly how scary it is for folks who are working through unemployment, who are trying to keep their small businesses alive. It's a scary time for lots of people in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And that's a lot to try and balance.
Well, and it's part of the reason I've been pushing for the federal government in its response to this to try to create some certainty and predictability for people. Because I think part of the reason it's scary is, if you're a small business and you know that there's a inadequately funded paycheck protection program, and you're competing with everybody and trying to rush to get it. And oh, by the way, when you get it, it's 8 weeks of help. And what happens at the end of the 8 weeks?
Mhm.
That creates tremendous uncertainty. I think and viewers probably know, my background before I got to Congress was working in economic development professionally. And as a concept, what I've observed is what most employers want from government is just an environment of trust and predictability. And that, part of the reason I've introduced this bill called the Paycheck Protection Program Extension Act is to provide that predictability in a really unpredictable time, to make sure that there's enough resources in that program so that our Main Street employers can get the help that they need. The only way they get it is if they hold on to their workers, right? So, that's not just about helping small business owners, it's about helping their employees. Um, Same thing with regard to the unemployment assistance. If this goes on for a prolonged period, the federal government needs to trigger additional support to states to make sure that someone who's lost their job gets the help that they need. I've introduced some legislation to provide emergency rental assistance to people because, again, people shouldn't have to fear losing their home because of something that's not their fault. And so I'm going to keep pushing for a strategic approach from the federal government just to make sure that in these really uncertain times, there's at least some sense from folks that they're not on their own.
Mhm. Absolutely. It couldn't be more important right now. What would you say specifically to Kitsap County residents, maybe not even as an elected official, but just as a human being enduring this time as well?
Well, one, I'm just really heartened by the extraordinary kindness that people are showing one another. There's been just incredible stories throughout Kitsap County of people going the extra mile for their neighbors or for local nonprofits, or, buying gift cards from their local small business to try to support them. Or I heard about someone sending pizza to firefighters and pizza to nurses and things like that. And honestly, my reaction to that is that's just cool. But it's just actually really inspiring that people are doing that. And so thank you for those who are recognizing that kindness is also contagious, for sharing that kindness. I would also mention people are part of the solution here. Each one of us, if we can what we've seen is a plateauing in the number of cases, but we've not seen that downward trajectory in the number of cases. And so the work that we do to stay home and stay healthy, the work we do to use hand sanitizer and wash our hands and practice social distancing, even when you have to go out, if you can wear a mask and maintain social distance, our ability to get back to, maybe a new normal, but at least some semblance of reopening, all of us have a role to play in that. The other thing I would say is, if my office can lend a hand to anybody who's watching this, please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out. I've got extraordinary caseworkers on my team. We have an extraordinary staff that's working day and night to help people. And I know there's a lot of people who need help right now. And my website is just kilmer.house.gov. My office is still open. We're all working remotely, but everybody's still working, and we want to be sure we're going the extra mile for you. The final thing I'll just say is keep the faith. I know this is a really challenging period, but I'm a genetically hopeful person that we will get through this. And I think together we can get through it.
I agree. I think we will. And as you said, I do hope it's a new normal. I hope it looks like something a little bit different than it did before, something that's a little bit more cohesive and hopefully brings us together in a positive way instead of driving us apart.
Amen. I'm with you.
Well, thanks so much for your time today. We really appreciate having you, and we appreciate you speaking with really the Kitsap community during this really difficult time.
You bet. Thanks for having me. And thanks for watching, everybody. Stay safe and stay well.